you go. So, welcome everyone. So, thank you for joining us today. Bonded Safeguarding Steering Group have been working with small organisations to understand the challenges that they face in relation to safeguarding. We heard in our listening exercises in February of this year a variety of challenges that we plan to support through these skills mapping sessions, and I'll add a blog in the chat box to give you more of an understanding of what we heard. This is the second of our 5 skills mapping sessions, first being hosted last month around the topic of culture. Today's session being on incident ready, and then there'll be 3 other sessions in the new year which will be focused on training, safeguarding practitioners' emotional well-being, and flipping conversations on their heads to better support partnerships. Today we're joined by Lee Hill, she's from WaterAid, and Steve Reeves, who is from Global Safeguarding, and they'll be taking us through today's session. So over to you two.
Thanks, Graham. And I think both Steve and I are just going to introduce ourselves quickly for those of you that don't know us. As Graham said, I'm Lee Hill. I'm the Global Head of Safeguarding at WaterAid, where I've been for the last 5 years now. WaterAid, for those of you that don't know, is an international development organisation who work primarily in the WASH and climate spaces, and we work predominantly through partnerships. So we have over 500 various partners operating in 28 different locations across a federated model. So it's quite complex in some respects, but also not as challenging as other large humanitarian organisations. So that's a bit about my background. Steve?
Thanks, Lee. Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Reeves. I'm one of the directors at Global Safeguarding, which is a specialist safeguarding organisation, and we've been running for probably 3 years now, with the objective of attempting to eliminate all forms of abuse and exploitation. So just a small objective for us there. But the way we do that is by trying to help organisations make maximum impact. So you wouldn't expect us to be running massive programs, but what you would expect us to do is to be working with organizations who already run programs to try and help them just be 1 degree better, 1 little bit more effective, and sort of leverage their impact. And so we do that through a whole variety of training courses, webinars, and consultancy. Previously, I was the director of safeguarding at Save the Children, so a fair amount of experience in the international development humanitarian space when it comes to safeguarding. Lee.
Thanks, Steve. Graham, can we have the next slide, please? So Graham has control of the slides, so we're going to be doing the next slide, please thing. And as Graham said, our theme today that we were asked to talk about is about being incident ready. So looking at how do we use the, I don't say the Q word very often in safeguarding, but how do we use the quieter times that we might have as organisations in order to better prepare for when things may not go as well as we expect or incidents happen. And we know no matter how much planning and preparation and proactive work you do as an organisation, incidents will and do occur. And we know that, and we know that, you know, one of the biggest concerns we hear, or I hear from organisations, you know, we have no incidents where we are. You know, my challenge to you is you don't have effective reporting mechanisms in place, which is why you don't have any incidents, not that they're not happening. So what happens when they do come to you? What are some of the core things that need to happen? And we recognise that this is very different in smaller organisations than it is to big organisations where Steve and I have experience of working. So we've tried to really strip it back to what are the basic things that organisations need in order to be effective. Next slide, please, Graham. So we thought that we'd approach this from the do no harm approach to planning. So being ready for something that may never happen prevents causing unintended harm if it does. So by not having plans in place, when an incident happens, what we can unintentionally do is cause further harm. Either that's because we fail to take a victim-centered approach, we place victim survivors, subjects of concern, our staff, all at additional risk of harm because we take the wrong actions with the good intentions, or we don't do anything at all because we don't know how, and so harm is allowed to continue. So that's the unintended part. So as I said, all safeguarding incident management should be taken from a do no harm approach, and we should ensure that we are victim survivor centered in all that we do. And a lot of that is quite hard to achieve. It's quite difficult. It's not easy, but as I say, it's something that you can plan for. And what we'll do as we go through any resources that we discuss or link to, we'll drop them in the chat box, or Graham will send them out after. So if we're talking about victim survivor centered, there's a really good resource from oh, my brain's gone, Steve, Graham, help me. The American Bond version. Interaction, that's the one. Interaction have come up with a set of standards which lots of organisations, including WaterAid, have signed up to, and these are the minimum requirements. No matter your organisation size, whether you're Save the Children or you're a small NGO working with WaterAid, it's the minimum requirements that we expect for a victim survivor centred response. Next slide, and Steve, over to you.
Thanks, Lee. What we wanted to do was get your fingers doing some work on the chat box, if we can, folks. We're interested in what you're thinking about in terms of being incident ready. What do we mean by this term? You're welcome to type away, and we will share some thoughts that people are sharing, or if people find difficulty with typing in the chat box or what have you, we can take some verbal input if that's helpful. So we'll just give people a moment to get to grips with their keyboards. So we've got some people making some contributions now around reporting mechanisms, ensuring that they're clear. The staff are trained, a clear, accessible reporting pathways. This is great. So it's like you predicted our slides, everybody. Gosh, this is remarkable. Some stuff here about focal points, inclusion in organizational strategy. You're now all typing too quickly for me to read. Lots of things about referral pathways here, which is great in terms of being prepared. Clear responsibilities and escalations. Training for focal points to have a survivor-centered approach. That's fantastic. These all come together, I think, and we're going to reference some of these, and you can hold us to account if we don't when we get to the Q&A session. If we move to the next slide here, what we sort of found ourselves thinking, well, what is it that we would think organizations that might not have the capacity to have standing safeguarding teams or specialists in post, what's the minimum that we would hope people would do? And actually, for us, incident ready is about having systems, processes, and people in place and prepared to respond to foreseeable incidents. So if we actually sit down and have an honest assessment of the nature of risk that your organization, your NGO might be carrying, there are some predictable risks here. We know that there is a potential for, employees, volunteers, those engaged in our work to exploit positions. That's not a judgment on individual organizations. That's a statement of fact. Regrettably, we see it across the sector in large organizations, small organizations, specialist, generalist organizations, humanitarian and development. So if we were really honest about foreseeing those potential problems, what is it that we'd have on the list that keeps us awake at night? And actually, do we have people who are sort of orientated, focused on those issues so that if an incident occurs, we can go straight into responding to that rather than panicking and being in a position of disbelief, if you like, about the fact an incident has occurred in the first place. So that's the premise on which we've started preparing this session for you. So I suspect we now need to do that. If you're not based in the UK, the humorous element of next slide, please, will be lost on you. But in the UK, we had these splendid news conferences throughout the pandemic, and none of our politicians know how to use PowerPoint. So every time they need to change slide, there was a next slide, please, from the Prime Minister or from whoever. So a bit of a standing joke for us in the UK. Lee, you can be the Prime Minister this time.
Excellent. I think anybody could give it a go in the UK at the moment and it'd be well received. Okay, so we looked at some 4 core things, because what we realize is with smaller NGOs in particular, and particularly with a lot of partners whom we work with in WaterAid, and I include government partners in that, is that actually if you try to do too much, you don't achieve anything. So actually aim for what really is the bare minimum of what you need to have in place, and anything else is a bonus. Okay, and this is, you know, not to say there's lots of other great suggestions in the chat box. I was having a look in there early, you know, safeguarding focal points, training, all of those things are fantastic. And absolutely, yes, if you've got the capacity to do it, do it. But recognizing that some organizations can literally be 3 people in a field office. So how do we utilize what we have? And one of the key things is incident reporting procedures. So this doesn't have to be a 10-page document. Actually, I would encourage you not to have a 10-page document, because nobody will read it and it will sit on a nice coffee shelf, never to be opened. So you want a really snappy set of operating procedures, which outlines roles and responsibilities for when something happens. So when there's a safeguarding incident, like Steve said, when one of your, you know, predictable risks, unfortunately, maybe one of your staff, one of your volunteers has allegedly sexually exploited a member of the community in which you're working, or abused a child, how are you going to deal with that? Who's going to take the lead? It should be clearly written down to know who's part of those key decision makers. Because the last thing you want to be doing is running around trying to consult everybody, because all you'll end up with is a lot of opinions and somebody still hasn't got to make the decision. So you need to know who's going to be involved and who's going to take what decisions, and any time frame. So time frames are critical when there's an incident. There's a critical 24-hour window of things that need to be done. And that should be clearly outlined within your reporting procedures. And that includes things such as ascertaining what support the victim survivor may need, if you know who the victim survivor is, and if they're cooperating with us, what will they need? There are certain things, particularly medical, that you'll need to be considering within those times. You need to look at what's the immediate risk to others and how are you managing that risk in the interim. Before you even get to any form of investigation, this is all the key, what we class as a case discussion that takes place. And in WaterAid, that primarily is our safeguarding officers, a key member of staff from where the incident has taken place or who may have reported it. So it might be a safeguarding focal point, it might be a program manager, it might be a regional director, but it could be who your operating person is. It just so happens that we have a large structure, so it tends to involve big titles. And we have a discussion around what are the immediate things we're going to do. And as I said, some of that is about risk management. And because you will be judged by what you do in those first 24 hours. So make sure that's critically written down and documented. Other things that you'll want to be considering, particularly if your charity is registered in the UK, is around any notifications to regulatory bodies. So Charity Commission states very helpfully or unhelpfully in their guidance that as soon as you have information to make a meaningful referral, or as soon as practically possible. So we generally tend to make those decisions as soon as we have all the relevant information to do so at WaterAid. That could be within the first 24 hours. It could be within the first week. It does depend upon what information you have available, because you may have very, very limited information. You need to decide if you have any donor requirements. So actually, are there any donor reporting requirements you might want to consider as part of that initial decision and discussion? And who's going to do that donor notification? Who has the relationship to do that, and who's best placed? And certain donors have certain criteria, particularly if you're working with your big donors such as USAID or CEDA. They have very specific reporting timelines for concerns, and I really would encourage you not to want to be falling foul of them, because it can become very difficult. The other thing that you want to be able to have in that procedure is your liaison points identified. So actually, who is in your organization who is best placed to do some of the liaison work? And by liaison work, I mean not the person who's managing the incident, because they're going to be busy managing the incident itself. Somebody who's going to be doing everything else around it. So that liaison point, so talking to maybe your board, talking to your donors, talking to the commission. Who are those people? You may, in some cases where you might have somebody who particularly liaises with the victim survivor because they have a rapport. So you want to be identifying those people and need to have timeframes for doing so. And it helps manage relationships if you have things written down, because you can refer people back to things. And I find that particularly helps with upwards management. of safeguarding issues and things is that actually you refer people back to your procedures. So when people say, oh, I don't want to do it like this, or I want to do it that way, it's no, we're doing it and we've got a clear set of procedures and this is why. You don't get into long discussions about it. And it's something I've learned over the last 12 years is quite handy to have. But like I say, I wouldn't, if your incident procedures are going sort of over 4 or 5 pages, then you really need to be considering what you're putting in there, because they won't be operational. They really do need to be really clear what they are. You can actually look at WaterAids if you wanted to. I believe they're on our website. It's not a secret document, and they're readily available. Oh, I think I've just answered that question from Sarah that's asked in the chat box there. Yes, we'll make sure that those are shareable. The second thing that's really critical is a safeguarding country map, sometimes as known as referral pathways. Some people mention them in the chat boxes. And what I've learned over the last 5 years or so is these mean different things in different organisations. And I do believe there's been many attempts as trying to collate them across the sector that's never quite worked. And that's because every organisation is different and every organisation has a different context. But these are essentially one side, 2-side maximum of information around where your program is. So I've said here safeguarding country maps. In India, for example, in WaterAid, we operate in about 8 different regions and we'll have 8 different maps or extensions of WaterAid India's map, because there's different cultural elements, there's different legal pathways, there's different organizations who you can refer people to in each location. So it is very localized. You can't just have one for one country and it ticks a box. And these are really key for when an incident occurs that you can go to and look at and see, okay, so is what's being reported to us a potential criminal offence in that country? If it is it safe to report it? Because just because something is a mandatory reporting somewhere doesn't mean you want to be mandatory reporting it. You need to be considering actually, is it safe to report something to the police in that country? What are the penalties of not reporting it? So you need to make an informed decision, and having this information beforehand, as opposed to trying to scurry around trying to find it on Google in the middle of an incident, is not going to help. So trying to have all your legalities written down so you know, even things like what's the age of consent? Do they subscribe to the UN Rights of a Child Convention? All of that information is really critical. You next want to be looking at your referral pathway for victims and survivors. So what specific support is available in your area that fundamentally you know to be safe? What you don't want to be doing is referring people on to services you haven't vetted. Okay, so you want, and I don't mean you have to go out and do a risk assessment and everything like that, but you just need to satisfy yourselves that they're a safe organisation. And what we generally tend to do in WaterAid is look at who's working in that area. It might be UNICEF, or it might be SAVE, or it might be something that has a skill that we don't have that we can refer people to that might be safe. For example, we're not an organisation that deals primarily with children. We're not a child abuse organisation. We don't have the ability to manage referral pathways for victims and survivors, but what we can do is refer them to safe onward support. It's also quite useful to know about any victim survivor rights organisations that are operating in that area who you might want to lean to for support. There's been some great ones in Malawi who are actually funded by the FCDO for a while. So there's lots of resources out there. You just have to do a little bit of digging to find them. And what we say is all of the country safeguarding maps of WaterAid have to be updated every 12 months. And that is a responsibility of our safeguarding focal points, but it's also the responsibility of our senior leaders to make sure that that's actioned and that's done, and we check them in the safeguarding team as well. If you're a very small organisation and you're working in 1 or 2 locations, this is really manageable and really well worth doing in advance. And I do believe there's some examples on the hub, Graham. I'm looking at Graham. I think there's some on the RSH hub of safeguarding maps. But what I would discourage you from doing is just lifting a map for a country from somewhere and copying it as your own, because it's going to be different, as I said, depending on where you're working and the type of programming you're doing as well. If you're specifically working in a high risk area, working with additionally vulnerable groups, you're going to need to have more detailed maps and plans in place than if you were working in a less risky area. So it does tie in with your risk assessment. And what I will say as well, they're very useful if anyone's taking on a new USAID grant. One of the requirements is to have a safeguarding plan in place, and this fits nicely into their requirements. And additionally, I'm happy to share some of WaterAid's safeguarding maps that we've got for some of our countries if that's useful. I was going to share my screen and show one, but I don't think we've really got time, Graham. So I will share them outside. Yes.
Thank you. And
Steve,
I'll put all
I think it's over to you.
Thanks, Lee. So the next building block that we wanted to talk to you about was having access to PSEA investigators. So either having folks in-house or certainly knowing who on speed dial you can get hold of to help you out at relatively short notice. This builds a lot on the country mapping that Lee's spoken about. So essentially, in some countries, there will be some timeframes that you need to work to in terms of completing investigations. In others, there may well be some mandatory reporting that needs to be dealt with. But essentially, in most contexts, at some point, you as an organization are going to end up having to conduct some form of investigation. It's important to remember, of course, that investigations are life-changing events for almost everybody involved in them. If you're a victim survivor, a complainant, if you're a subject of concern, even if you're a witness to something, actually they can have a huge toll on people, and they can cause huge amounts of stress. Certainly, if you're a subject of concern and inadequately run investigation, can very seriously affect your career. You know, you may well feel that you've been unfairly treated, for example. If you're a victim survivor, we know that the way in which investigations are conducted, completed, can have a significant impact on the way in which people might recover from any abuse or exploitation that they've experienced. So this is not an area where you necessarily want to have beginners operating, if at all possible. It is true that there's lots of training opportunities for investigators, and they're growing and growing now. Bond can provide some access to recommendations around training for PSEA investigators. Some organizations will want to invest in that. It can be a heavy investment if you, A, don't have current cases, and B, don't necessarily foresee large amounts of work for those folks, because of course it's like any other skill. If you're trained and you don't then use those skills, you can very quickly become rusty. So for a lot of people, it's not about necessarily investing in trained staff for their own organization. It's about having access to investigators who they can access quickly or recruit quickly and deploy quickly if needs be. There's a whole collection of things you might think about in terms of when you deploy or choose investigators, the gender of investigators, language skills, previous experience with particular types of investigations are important. This is one of those areas, again, as Lee's made clear, really, I guess from WaterAid perspective, this is not a competitive area of work for NGOs. There will be NGOs operating in similar places to where your organization is operating, who will have more experience, more capacity, more personnel than you do. And I am absolutely sure that if you approach them in moments of calm rather than in the middle of a crisis, to say, look, is there a way we could sit down and talk about how we might access your expertise for technical advice if and when we needed it, because we don't have many of these incidents? I am absolutely sure that most of the large NGOs with a big footprint would more than happily have conversations with NGOs that have less sort of infrastructure to deal with these sorts of things. So borrowing skills is certainly viable. We know that in the international aid sector, safeguarding is a shared risk. And so therefore it's not unreasonable for the solution to be shared too. There are other organizations, we're one, who offer services whereby, you know, for a small monthly payment, you can have access to investigators routinely. We're not the only organization that do that, I know. And there's a whole collection of consultants with qualifications listed on the Resource Support Hub website. And I know that the majority of those consultants would be more than happy to have a 30-minute, 60-minute conversation in advance of a crisis about what services they can provide so that you can get an idea of who might suit incidents that you've got coming up reasonably. So real message there when it comes to PSEAs, this is important, this is serious, you want really good people, but it's not impossible to plan for that. You can make contact with good people in advance, have a conversation with them. I guarantee you that if they are a competent PSEA investigator, they will know why you're doing it and they'll be very happy to have that conversation with you. The next thing, the next building block, if you like, we wanted to talk about was about public relations, ironically. And I say ironically because very often large organizations, well, any organization, are very often accused of worrying more about their reputation than about people. That, of course, can be true in some circumstances, but it most certainly shouldn't be true for people on this call. The objective for any safeguarding activity should be best outcomes for the people involved, not for the organization involved. But what we know is that in the middle of a crisis, organizations become really worried about these things. And therefore, that's a foreseeable risk for an organization, for you as people who might take a lead on safeguarding. So actually, it's worth us thinking about this in advance. And it's fair to accept that reputation of organizations, public relations, media management is important for organizations. It's just not the most important thing in this circumstance, but it is important. It's reasonable to worry about that. It's just not reasonable to take steps that only deal with that. So it may be that in your organization, you spend some time thinking in times of calm about what sort of advice you think you can access in these instances. Again, can you borrow resources from others? If you're a downstream partner for an organization with a large media or fundraising capacity, they almost certainly will be able to give you some technical advice around how to respond in a crisis management situation. And there's a mutual benefit to that. If you're a partner to another organization, they probably would be more than helpful to have those conversations. What we do know is useful, though, again, similar in some ways to the documents Lee was talking about earlier, is that having an outline, a skeleton, if asked statement. So what is it that you would like the media or the public to know about the efforts you take around safeguarding more generally when an incident occurs? So there will be some elements that have to be specific to what you've done in a specific circumstance, but actually having some general text that you're all comfortable with in your organization that is signed off, that you agree, takes away an awful lot of hassle and difficulty of trying to draft whilst people are running solely on adrenaline in the middle of a crisis. It's not always the best way to get the most measured language for your PR situation. So all of these things we're saying that actually build on each other quite comfortably. So these are sort of in order of priority, if you like. So actually media management is important, but please don't make it the most important thing when you get to planning. The very best thing you can do is to do those things that Lee spoke about, the very first part about how do we get your organization thinking in the right way, having the right procedures, having the right decision makers informed about what needs to happen. And as we move across this slide towards the media relations element, actually these all build on each other, and that should put you in a much stronger position. Leo, I'm handing over to you.
Yeah, I think so. I was just going to build on what you were saying, Steve, in terms of borrowing skills from partners. And I'm quite happy to talk a bit about that from a WaterAid perspective in terms of, as I said, we deal with, I say, over 500 partners, corporate partners, government partners, really small NGOs, large NGOs, and some NGOs that are bigger than us. But what we do try and do when we do our partner assessment, because no matter who we partner with, we have a safeguarding assessment that all partners have to go through, which identifies strengths and weaknesses. And what we say actually is if we identify a weakness with a partner, that's okay if we know about it. Let's capacity build and work together. And if we've got a partner who we know through our capacity assessment hasn't got access, for example, to train PSA investigators if there was to be an incident, we know that if there is an incident that happens involving their organisation and they report it to us in line with our procedures, we can support them with that. You know, we're happy to be that skill that can be borrowed. So it's about asking, and if you don't ask, you don't get. So actually, ask big organizations, as Steve said, with large footprints, ask them what they're going to do to support you. Say to them, we want to be good at this, help us. And that's what large organizations want to hear as well. If we're partnering with somebody that doesn't talk about safeguarding, our program teams are going to be concerned. So you please do, as small NGOs, ask the question, can you support us on this? Or what does support look like? And most will be more than happy to do so, because it works both ways. It protects them as well. It protects their investment in you. Other things to think about as well with trained investigators. I know Steve spoke about lots of options in terms of accessing investigators, is to just notice all the other thing you might want to be thinking about in times of calm is budgets. We haven't put it on there, but it's tough in terms of, even from a large INGO perspective, budgeting it's hard to get money for safeguarding historically, ironically. It's not easy. So you're looking at, I think, Steve, we said yesterday, and we were discussing this, it's between $10,000 and $12,000 for a PSC. I mean, recently that's a bill that I've signed off for an investigation that you're looking at, and that's for one, potentially two, because most investigators won't work alone. So you often need two, and whether that's you pair a trained investigator with a member of your staff, for example, is always an option, or you have two investigators. Often you need a gender balance, as Steve alluded to. You may need a translator. All of these costs, may need to bring people into country. You need a neutral venue. All of these add up to being quite expensive and actually cost prohibitive for a lot of organizations. Not a lot of organizations have that sort of money about anyway, but not quickly. So the other thing I would say to you is, if you're having conversations with boards, with big decision makers, is highlight these costs now in periods of time of quiet, not when your back's up against a wall and you haven't got a choice, because it's not going to be a great conversation. So you do want to start thinking about what costs are involved in that, and having a pot of money if you can, and if not, highly encourage you to have those borrowing skills conversations, and also discuss the awkwardness of who's going to fund those as well, so that no one's disappointed. And I don't think I've got anything else. I mean, some of the other things that you've touched on, I said in the chat box, are fantastic. Training staff and SS safeguarding focal points in particular are great for being incident ready, because you've got people who are able to give you context on the ground, particularly if you've got central teams, or you're managing a team from a central office that's where the incident took place 400 or 500 miles away. Having people who know the context is really helpful and relevant as well, and I'd encourage you to draw on them and to train all your staff to be able to have that contextual knowledge for you to draw upon in an incident. Is really helpful.
I wonder whether sorry, Lee, I was just going to say, I wonder whether or not we're having the benefit of people are making some great comments in here. They're also sending direct messages, which I didn't know you could do. So there's a couple of questions that I've had sent to me, which is great, but everybody else might not see them. One person quite legitimately raises with us, and this is a risk when you have worked in large organizations, is that sometimes there's a risk that we associate large with competent. And regrettably, that isn't always the case, is it? So actually, there will be organizations that, when we talk about borrowing skills or creating partnerships, it's not necessarily always organizations that are of a smaller scale looking to massive global organizations. It might be that in the areas you work, when you do that mapping, there will be some relatively small but really specialized, effective, talented organizations that can really provide you with some added support and guidance or technical advice. So absolutely worth remembering that. And that's our bad, really, if we've given the impression that big is always best. Speaking as someone who worked in a very large organization, I can promise you big isn't always best. And I think Lee is very diplomatically smiling and nodding at that point. There's a point here about the confidentiality, Lee, and I'm just conscious, we've worked together on a couple of these things, that, if you're borrowing skills or working with other partners, particularly when incidents are occurring, how do you get comfortable about sharing what is essentially really confidential information, sensitive information with people outside your organization?
I suppose some of that is around having the conversations before you get to a crisis. So you've already got a pre-established relationship with a potential investigator or a potential organization. And you can have NDAs in place. You know, they're not my favorite thing, but they protect all parties. They tend to make people feel comfortable. And again, it's something you can prepare in advance. You can prepare a standard NDA, have it checked over by legal, whatever. And it can be ready in your pack of things that you have available to you. But also as well having the honest conversation of actually you shouldn't have anything you should be needing to hide per se, and certainly shouldn't be hiding things from investigators. So being able to have an open and honest relationship is key, I've found. And just to echo Steve's point, absolutely our bad if we gave the impression that big is best. That's not the case. As I said, we partner with many small organizations. I said to you earlier, we've got specific links with as victim survivor service in Malawi, who are fantastic. If anyone operates in Malawi, I'm happy to pass it on. But there is some really great organizations who really understand context, and I can't highlight that enough. There is no, you know, I'm fortunate enough to have a central safeguarding team that work with me, but actually that's not useful in understanding 28 different contexts. You know, that's where you're gonna need your local contextual knowledge that comes from having well-trained local staff whom are fundamental, and your smaller organizations. Absolutely. I think it's question time, Steve. So if we want to
Fabulous.
do more of those questions, do you want us to read? I said, Graham, I think there was an instruction about we need to read them out, otherwise the captioning doesn't get it. Is that right? Yeah. Okay.
Got you.
Please,
So
yeah.
there's one here that's just come in here. I need to put my glasses on because I didn't, and we are recording, so my poor eyesight's there for posterity. So the sort of trained human resource and all the funds are key for investigations. Is there a fund somewhere from a big generous donor that can help small organizations with access? I'm going to pass that over. I mean, Lee, probably you would know about something. I know there's some UN funds, aren't there? But accessing them is probably more difficult than actually doing the investigation. But Graham, I don't know whether or not you've got any points.
No, I mean, we talk about partnerships a lot in our work, and Bond works on sort of partnering with our members. So partnerships, I think, are the way forward in the sense of small organizations getting some money to be able to do these things in those downstream sort of settings. Yeah, that's my biggest. And if anyone needs any guidance around partnerships, let me know.
And worth emphasizing this point that whilst very often it feels like an awful thing to have to think about, you know, this being prepared and resourcing some of this work, that almost certainly, if you are working with, I hesitate to talk about scale, but certainly organizations who might feel more exposed to the risks around safeguarding. So certainly those that would have large sort of public profiles or what have you, they will welcome these conversations with you at the start of a partnership about what we're going to do in the event that something goes wrong. And having been somebody, I know Lee's the same, having been somebody that sits in a meeting with those people, it's always a positive sign when somebody says, okay, this is a great partnership. What are we going to do if there's a difficulty? How are we going to support each other? So there could well be that resource that's accessible there. And I think increasingly donors are willing to have that conversation. They might not necessarily be willing to fund it, but they certainly will not weaken your position with donors if in conversations with them you ask about including a budget line for safeguarding, or you ask them how you access contingency funding or whatever in the event of a difficulty. The worst they're going to say is no. I can almost guarantee they will not take your funding away because you're trying to plan ahead in the event of a risk that would also expose them as much as it would expose you. Anything else? There's there's some advice here in the box that people have got about Resource Support Hub having some good tip sheets on advocacy for donors. So I guess having that confidence around having those conversations. Again, somebody else pointing out building in a safeguarding item, if you like, into a budget for donors. The worst that's going to happen, I promise you folks, is that the donor might delete that line. They will not delete your whole application simply because you've asked for some contingency money in the event of something going wrong. But I think as it stands, we're not aware of any large pots of money where people are desperately waiting to pay for your investigators or investigations. That we can't help with, I think. We've got a couple of hands up. Sorry, Lee, go for it.
Sorry, I was just going to say there are some reduced training rates. I know that there are some courses for investigators that have reduced rates for smaller NGOs. That also might be worth investigating, and always ask the question. Actually, the worst they're going to do is say no, we can't. But on the off chance somebody might say yes. And also, as I would say, as being somebody who sits on those conversations or has teams that do, in terms of when small partners ask for funding for safeguarding, majority of the time it's going to be yes. It may not be that we'll train your investigators, but maybe your investigators could come on some of our training. Your staff would come on some of our training and we could pair together. So I think there's lots of creative ways now. Lots of organizations, big and small, have safeguarding frameworks and strategies, a part of which is building the sector to be better. And we're only as good as our weakest link. So as a sector, it benefits everybody if everybody can access a similar platform. So absolutely, what I'm encouraging you to do is have those brave conversations and discussions. We've got a couple of hands up, Steve. I don't know who was up, Richard and then Sarah.
Yeah, Richard, I think you can unmute and speak to us, Richard, if you can.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much and good evening. My name is Richard Oneka. I work for Oxfam. I'm calling from South Sudan. Okay, I joined from South Sudan. I like quite the discussion and it's quite so interesting. And really, I don't really have a question per se, but really contributing to the discussion. And straight away, starting from the last point, is about the investigators, because it's quite a big challenge, as already has been acknowledged. And there is quite a lot of discussion currently ongoing, like in South Sudan, where we are talking about a pool of investigators for national organizations, because we acknowledge that training investigators and having investigators for each organization might be very difficult and expensive. So we are talking about, for example, Oxfam, currently we are having around 12 national partners in South Sudan. And we are talking about having a pool of investigators within this partner organization who can then investigate whenever there's a case around this organization. But also, as you have already mentioned, as Steve has also emphasized, that increasingly donors are becoming more acceptable for funding safeguarding costs, including investigation. But then the challenge that we have seen with most of our partners is about how do they want to bring that in their proposal? Because bringing straightforward in the proposal that you want investigators without talking about the other safeguarding activities, then makes it's like you're shooting yourself in the foot. It is not convincing to the donor. But when you talk about how you want to ensure your programs are safe, then there are a lot of other activities that you want to bring forward before you talk about investigation, because investigation is always at the tail end of safeguarding. So that is something we are trying to build capacity within our partnership. And lastly, I like the whole discussion around minimum standard for incident readiness. And my addition to that is normally with the discussion around localization, the application of that standard need to be guided by experienced people in the field of safeguarding. Because the trap that I've seen around local organization or local partners is copying and pasting whatever standard that they have seen somewhere. For example, if you are talking about incident operating procedure, there's a tendency of somebody want to copy and paste the procedures, and yet a procedure for Waterhead will not apply to Oxfam, will not apply to a national organization. So what we are doing so far is to support the national organization to develop their own procedures, because they need to develop what works for them, not what the standard procedure has been mentioned somewhere. But I like the generic way it has been brought out in this discussion. And the emphasis would be they need to get support from maybe their donor organization or their parent partners on how they should build this system in their organization. But generally, I like the way it has been brought out. So thank you so much for this exciting discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. That was great. And it was great to hear there about, how you have to sell a safeguarding package to a donor. I wouldn't advise jumping straight in with you'd want investigators, because as you say, that doesn't suggest to donors who maybe don't have a great understanding of safeguarding. It doesn't play well. So you would want to be talking about all of your preventative work, but also including the fact that there would be support needed for investigations as part of that wider picture. And I think we've got some guidance for safeguarding budgeting somewhere on the RSH, on the hub actually, Graham, so we can find that and share that as well.
There was on that point, Lee, before we move to Sarah, perhaps give Sarah a moment to find the mute key. Somebody's asked for us just to remind people about those sort of indicative costs that you mentioned and what they might come at. So that's a good point when you're talking about budgeting, maybe just to remind people.
Yeah, so I think was that the question around the indicative cost of what the investigation covers, or
Yeah,
just
so
safeguarding in general?
Yeah, so I think somebody's asking, can you remind us of the costs again and what that covers? So I think it's when you were talking about the cost of investigation.
So I think the average we came to, Steve, was between $10,000 and $12,000. I think somebody made the point that that's more than some organizations' annual turnover, which is a fair point. But what does that include? That includes the investigator's time. Usually it's a daily rate. You're usually going to be flying them in from somewhere. So it would be their expenses, it would be their travel, it would be hiring of a neutral facility. So often you can't have safeguarding investigations taking place in an office where everybody can see what's going on. It often includes all sorts of simple things that people forget, like visa costs, all of which can be really high for some places, but also your transfer costs, any security costs associated. So actually, if you're working in an unsafe zone, what are your security implications of people movement? Also looking at, say, translation costs, safe translation costs. And then you're looking at your investigator's time in writing up your report, depending on what you've specified in your obviously well-defined TOR when you're onboarding an investigator. As another tip, you should have a pre-prepared terms of reference for investigators. Then obviously that's going to impact on their time. So it does include a lot for what you're getting. But essentially you're paying for a report to tell you on the balance of probability whether something did or did not occur, or it may be that they actually can't determine that at all. So it can be really a really tough place to be in. But as Steve highlighted, it really does need to be done by people who have the skills, because of the potential, and I'll take it back to what we said at the beginning, to cause more harm by having people who don't have the relative skills in place to do that. So I would really discourage organizations from trying to make do when it comes to investigations, because you will cause harm unintentionally. I think we're going over to Sarah. Sarah, have you found the unmute button?
I have indeed. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much. This was a really, really great session. I had a couple of really specific questions. I work with Concern Worldwide in Sierra Leone, and we've actually just been awarded a new grant from FCDO. FCDO obviously has some quite stringent due diligence and standards that they like all sub-grantees to adhere to in terms of safeguarding. But I think they do fall into that category where there's a very high donor ambition and very little realism about the context in which they're funding programs. And so you end up trying to almost perform magic programming, which I think we can all agree does run a very big risk of kind of a chain of unintended consequences, even though the starting point is coming from a positive place. So in the context here, I still think it's a great thing that we are proposing to do, and it's almost in line with what you've been talking about today, actually. So we're calling it a preparation to respond program with the government, which is more than a little daunting. So this is a health system strengthening program in a country where there actually, if you ask for the healthcare code of conduct, nobody can lay their hands on it other than to say there is one. We actually did design and implement the first ever healthcare safeguarding program during COVID, and it was specifically for a COVID treatment center. And it was fantastic and got a lot of buy-in. It was obviously hugely expensive, but there was a lot of funding at that time. Now we're back to our general development context. And although we're a very small country, since the end of Ebola, protection and safeguarding services are dissolving. So there is no legal framework. There is no policy framework, either within the government as a whole or within the health system. As I said, there's no code of conduct. Ethics is not treated in pre-service training. And so it's not that the way that we sold it to the donor, going back to what Richard was saying, is that, you know, FCDO have been funding programs here for 30 plus years and have never funded system strengthening in terms of safeguarding. So we actually, my way of selling things is to say, you have to do this. Which seemed to work, so that was good. But now we're kind of faced with this, at what point do you have to start somewhere? It's absolutely wrong that none of us as health organizations have done this up until this point. However, we still have to recognize that we do need to not cause harm through this program. And so there's a very blurred line where you get to the end of preparation to respond and actual response, because we cannot operate response services in every district, every health facility. We've tried to mitigate as much as possible. So there'll be a CRM dedicated, and FCDO, you know, in fairness to them, they're agreed to fund a specific CRM hotline, toll-free hotline. We will be training, we'll have PSEA and mental health support funded through the program. But there are going to be a few individuals in what is an entire health system. And my biggest concern now, I still am excited that we're doing the program, but I'm also terrified at how badly wrong it could go. And then the other thing is looking at, you know, when we're mapping those services in a context where those services don't exist, except for a few, and we're very lucky we have the Rainbow Centers here, but only in a few districts. So that's an amazing service for survivors in those areas. But what about everybody else? Here, the government says that those services are available in every primary healthcare center. Like you said, vetting to see the level, you know, of confidence we have in those services. I can tell you what mine is. You can probably anticipate my response. And so these are the, you know, it becomes quite a daunting task. And I think we do have to start somewhere. We absolutely do have to start somewhere. And we will be doing a lot of work with the communities as well to try and change the culture around reporting and around understanding of what is a breach of somebody's healthcare rights, of safeguarding. And we'll be looking at that not only in terms of PSEA, but also healthcare neglect, those kind of things. We'll be doing ethics training with health workers. But I still think we probably have some very big potholes that we could be falling down during the course of the next 5 years. So it'd be interesting to hear from any of the organizations and yourselves. What do you think are some of the risks that we might not have, might not be so obvious to us now, and maybe some of the ways we could mitigate those, given that we're working in a government system?
Thanks, Sarah. Big questions, but first of all, congratulations for what you're doing already. As you say, everybody has to start somewhere, and it's not easy. And, you know, I've personally worked in Sierra Leone with WaterAid before. I think we were exiting exiting Sierra Leone this year, but historically we've worked there, and it is a challenging environment working through governments, and we partner with governments solely in other places such as Ethiopia where we work, and it's a different challenge particularly in terms of investigations, particularly if the alleged offence is conducted by a government official, because you have zero ability to be able to investigate that. All you can do is support and guide and advise, and that's really challenging. But that, as you say, you have to start somewhere. What I would say is, you made a really good point about vetting services in terms of, governments might say there's access to, sexual health clinics, services, counselling support within hubs, but within districts, but we know, and people are going to know, that that's not accessible. So our response is always, what else is there, usually provided by another NGO within that vicinity you could partner with to provide joint services. In terms of your question of what have you not thought about, I think you've thought about most things, but it comes down to your risk assessment. So where have you identified what are your high risks and how are they tying in with your referral mapping? So not only are you you've got your risk mitigations, you've got what are you going to do in the event that it does happen and those mitigations don't work. So where are your referral pathways on your map? As I say, partnering with your other organizations. The training sounds great, and building in your investigator capacity, but it goes back to the point that Steve said, if investigators don't use their skills, they lose them. I know that if I don't go out and do an investigation for a year after COVID, for example, it's pretty rusty. In terms of it's a muscle you don't use, you don't flex it. So you do have to make sure that if you're training staff, you make sure you're doing what we do is like simulation case studies. So giving people opportunities to practice what it feels like to be in an investigation. And there's case study examples. I think Graham's got some nice case study examples that you could use and build on to be able to do that, to draw some training sessions out. So training's brilliant, but don't do it as a one-off because it won't work. Because when you need it, they won't have the capacity, and you'll end up having in a situation whereby you've got the potential for causing more harm. Yeah. Steve, I don't know if you've got anything to add to Sarah's points.
I mean, just to emphasize that point, Lee, I'm conscious of people's time, but that that training is a process about learning and development, not an event. So actually, it's not about running a course. It's about making sure that people have the opportunity to try the skills, be supervised, speak to people with more experience, mentor people with less experience. It's a real process. And if you're in that position, well, actually, maybe you're in a good position then to help some other organizations with some technical advice that actually helps them hugely and actually helps you as well, because it helps your trained people keep in touch with what's going on and issues and things. But sounds like a great piece of work. Brilliant. Thank you. Graham, are we handing over to you?
Yes, whilst I pop a poll on the screen, I think Talal would want to just make a comment to you guys if you've got a couple of minutes, and I'll be popping a poll on the screen, as I said in my chat, to get some initial feedback. But before Talal talks, I just want to say thanks to Steve and Lee for their work on this session. It's been absolutely fantastic. Got some great feedback already, super helpful questions. Everyone's asked. Thanks for your engagement with it, and that we will be we'll be hosting another one very soon. So thank you all.
So can I go?
Go for it.
Perfect. So hello everybody. My name is Talal Maroof. I'm coming from Egypt. I had the chance to work in a mix and match of all the organizations mentioned based on the scale and the presumed expertise. Maybe I'll just provide my intervention a little bit in reverse. That, okay, everybody wants to apply safeguarding, but nobody tells you what are you expected to do when you are in that situation. Even if you have all the list at that Steve started the conversation with, problems will happen. So maybe I can reflect on my experience as a doctor, and I have worked on HIV as well, in addition to working with migrants and refugees. So maybe we have to stop looking at safeguarding as a function rather than it's an ethical responsibility of the organization. I'm not gonna talk about how I'm gonna fix the damage if this kind of malpractice or malbehavior happened in my organization, because the tendency moves towards like denying what's happening rather than putting it into the current perspective, just like to fix the situation. And because at the end of the day, such work will reflect on the overall protection duty or the protection mandate that the the organization undertakes. The second point, maybe with HIV and safeguarding, I guess, it's both are but highly stigmatized. So definitely context sensitivity is highly needed. And in addition to sensitivity, it's the context sensibility, I would say. And I'm happy that the first intervention was from South Sudan. And for an Arabic speaker, there's the word bellish. In Syria, it might mean start. And in Sudan, it might mean end. So these kind of nuances might be needed when you are handling such a case. Also, working from HIV and working with migrants and refugees, we need to look at if the person who are like at the receiving end of that service, or like someone who's in need for safeguarding, is under like a punitive or like unregulated status in a given country. Like I'm just talking about HIV because definitely it was socially stigmatized, yet that led to workplace discrimination and so forth and so on. The third, when it comes to enabling environment for PSAH, because maybe we can see how the power dynamics might affect people who might be inclined or not inclined to talk about a given case or like to just report it. Lastly, I would say also part of the HIV movement, there was a lot of discussions about HIV initiated testing. In a sense, okay, you might see a person who might having like showing symptoms of distress or have been going through like a state of abuse, for example. I'm not a PSA expert, but I'm talking it from a research perspective, how I'm gonna make it easy for such people to seek or to achieve reporting their incident rather than just like thinking about what the donor wants when it comes to safeguarding practices. Yeah, and also working with HIV also that gives you like that we cannot look at people as unempowered or through a negative lens. That's the idea. It doesn't mean that a person is a refugee or a migrant, for example. That doesn't mean that they come from a background with high education and so forth and so on. And lastly, when it comes to enable people to have access to the panic button or to the emergency button, I guess we need to make sure that, okay, people are also aware that they are accessible when it comes to disabilities, for example. These are my points, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Talal. Amazing. Any final comments from Lee or Steve?
Not for me, just a big thank you to everybody that's participated. I have to say, it's great to have some of the feedback, both directly and to the group. So we're really grateful for that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, just to echo Steve, thank you everyone for being here and for being in the space, and for those that have shared experiences, it's fantastic. So thank you so much, and also happy to take any other questions. I think Graham will send around our contact details if you want to reach out. Really happy to have conversations, and as I said before, if you don't ask, you don't get. So thanks so much.
Thanks all.